I've always worked delivery jobs ever since I was in my teens. When I was in high school, I delivered pizzas for 2 years, then switched over to doing Amazon deliveries until I was 24. I've never minded driving for long periods of time, and I actually kind of enjoyed it, so I ended up getting my CDL Class A license and started working as a freight truck driver in my hometown in Texas. I've been driving an 18-wheeler for a little over 6 years now, and the job has basically become my life. In the winter months, my boss puts me on the same route for the entire season, which is a 30-hour round trip to Kentucky and back. I've probably driven this route at least 20 times, so I'm extremely familiar with it. Last December, I was scheduled to depart from our terminal in Texas to Kentucky on a Monday. I left at 5 a.m. and began the 15-hour drive to Kentucky to drop off the load, then backhaul a full trailer to Texas. For the first several hours, the weather was fine, but as I continued heading up north, I started to run into some poor weather. The roads in Tennessee were slick, and they had gotten quite a bit of snow in the past few hours. Once I pulled into a rest stop, I checked the weather for Kentucky, and it wasn't looking good. They were expecting snow for the entire time I'd be there, and it had been snowing there all day. Once I made it into Kentucky, the roads continued to get worse, which only extended my ETA. I ended up arriving to my destination at midnight, and once they unloaded and loaded my trailer, I started heading back. Knowing that I'd need to sleep soon, I pulled into a rest stop in the Appalachian Mountains around 1:30 a.m. for the night. I had slept there a couple times, mostly because it was pretty secluded and quiet. It wasn't fancy by any means, only having a bathroom and a couple vending machines. As I pulled in, I watched a white Honda Civic pulling out. The parking lot was completely vacant, so I got out to use the restroom before heading back into the cabin sleeping. Once I got inside the bathroom, I pushed open the first door to use the stall, but it was locked. I took a step back and quickly realized that someone was in there, as I noticed that there were 2 black boots under the door. I awkwardly gave him a sorry, then entered the stall directly next to his. He didn't reply, but I went about my business and finished up before him. On my way out, I said that I was sorry again and let out a nervous laugh, but like before, he said nothing back. I shrugged it off and walked back out to my truck, curious as to where his car was parked. My truck was the only vehicle in the lot, so I started theorizing that he was homeless and needed somewhere warm to stay. I had to get to sleep soon, because I had to be back on the road by 7 a.m. the next morning. I went into the back of my cab and rolled out my sleeping bag, then threw it on the bed and turned on the heater in the back. Since my truck was facing the rest stop bathrooms, I occasionally glanced over there to see if the guy walked out at any point while I was getting ready for bed. Even after another 10 minutes passed, the guy was still not out of the bathroom. I pretty much accepted he'd be staying there for the night, so I double-checked to make sure the doors were locked and made my way to the back of the cab, then laid down and went to sleep. I passed out quickly, but woke back up a few hours later. I don't think anything specifically caused me to wake up, since I always have difficulty sleeping on the road anyways. I had to use the bathroom again, so I zipped up my jacket and got out. Despite the freezing cold winds, I was still half asleep, but that all changed when I opened the bathroom door to get inside. The room was completely dark. As soon as I stepped in, the motion sensor lights flicked on, and I couldn't believe what I saw. The same person from earlier was still sitting in the stall. Realizing something was seriously wrong, I knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay, to which I again got no response. I pounded on the door a little louder, but like before, he didn't say anything back. So I yelled even louder, and when I didn't hear a response, I kicked the door open. What I saw on the other side was the most horrific sight of my life. Sitting on the toilet was a man with a gunshot wound to the head. His head was slumped over to the side, and his wallet was sitting in his lap. I started gagging, so I ran back out to my truck and immediately called the police. 2 highway patrol cars pulled into the lot, shortly followed by an ambulance and more police. They took down my statement and began an investigation. I was eventually cleared by my boss and the police to drive back, so I spent the next 14 hours completely in my head, replaying the events over and over. It was such an awful and sickening sight. Life went on as usual, but those images in my mind have still never left me. A couple weeks after this incident, the detective followed up with me on the case. The man in the stall was found leaving the back seat of a white Ford Explorer, along with 2 males in the front seat on the security camera. The men from the front seats were wearing hoodies, completely covering their faces. The 3 of them walked into the bathroom, but only 2 of them came out. As the car began to pull out, I was pulling in, and I unknowingly watched the killers drive away. Then, myself, completely oblivious, spent 3 hours at this rest stop with this man who was killed seconds before I arrived. The man was reported missing hours before, and the police believed that the 2 men were human traffickers. Whenever I'm at rest stops now, I'm always very cautious and alert. I wish I could unlive that night, so I wouldn't have to think about it every time I pull into a rest stop for the rest of my career. My name is John, and I'm a semi-truck driver. In this field, I spend most of my days on the road, hauling cargo from one end of the country to the other. My office is basically the cab of my truck, where I'm surrounded by the hum of the engine and the endless expanse of highway. It can be a lonely job, but there's a certain freedom in the solitude of the road. I've been on the job for over 10 years, and I have driven across almost every state in the US, delivering goods to various locations. My work involves long hours on the road, and it can be both physically and mentally demanding, but I enjoy it. I get to see different parts of the country and meet new people. It's also satisfying to know that I play a crucial role in the supply chain and help keep the economy moving. However, there was one incident that made me question if the job was ever worth the risk. It was a typical night, and I was driving on a remote stretch of highway in the middle of Arkansas. The rain was coming down in sheets all night, and the visibility was practically zero. I was navigating purely by the light of my headlights, so I really had to concentrate. I'd been on the road for over 8 hours, and was looking forward to reaching my mile marker for the night so I could pull over and get some rest. As I made my way around the bend on the highway, I nearly crashed my truck. Standing there, in the middle of the road, was a woman. Due to the poor visibility, I didn't see her until the last second, so I slammed on my brakes, almost spinning out into the woods. This jolted me awake, and I stepped out of the truck to ask her what she was doing and if she was okay. She looked extremely disheveled and seemed to be in her 20s and was wearing a nightgown. Her shoes were covered in mud, and it looked like she'd been walking alongside the road for quite some time. As she spoke, it seemed clear to me that she'd been crying. She told me that her boyfriend was driving her home when they got into a fight and he kicked her out about an hour ago, which is why she tried flagging me down when she saw me. I asked her if there was anything I could do to help, and she replied saying that she really needed a ride as she reached into her purse and grabbed a $20 bill. It felt wrong to just leave her out here by herself in the pouring rain at night, so I agreed to take her to a rest stop a few miles up the road. Once we started driving, she wouldn't say a single word, completely ignoring everything I said. She was positioned in the passenger seat with her head up against the side window, frantically typing on her phone. I started to get a bad feeling that something was off, but I was only a mile away from the rest stop, so I kept to myself and focused on getting there without any problems. Once we passed the rest stop sign, I told the girl that we were there, and she looked up from her phone for the first time and nodded her head. As soon as I flipped on my turn signal to pull in the lot, she started fumbling around in her purse. I couldn't tell what she was doing, but I kind of assumed she was trying to pay me, even though I'd already declined her offer. Before I could even park, I saw out of the corner of my eye that she had a gun pointed at my head. I stopped the truck and lifted my hands up off of the steering wheel, but before I could even say anything, she sternly said, "Drive. Try anything and you're done." I was in utter disbelief, and I couldn't even believe that this was happening. I nodded my head as I started to drive, and I merged back onto the highway. She grabbed my phone out of the cup holder and put it in her purse, then unplugged the CB radio. Although I had a million questions, I didn't say a single word, realizing one bad move could cost me my life. I'm not even sure how long we drove, because every passing second felt like an hour. At some point, she broke the silence. "You're going to get off at the next exit. Turn right and drive until I tell you to stop." I nodded my head in compliance and switched over to the far right lane to get off. Once we got off, I turned right at the intersection and began driving. Woods surrounded each side of the road, and wherever we were seemed to be very desolate. Shortly after turning down this road, she had me turn down a dirt pathway that cut through the woods. I could barely fit the truck on the road, but I didn't ask any questions and continued to comply. Soon after making the turn, I spotted several headlights up ahead. I started to feel nauseous, realizing that these people were probably with her. Once I was within feet behind the cars, she told me to stay put, emphasizing that she will shoot me if I attempted to leave. The thought of leaving certainly crossed my mind, but attempting to do a 3-point turn would be impossible, so I stayed put as she got out. There were 2 trucks parked directly in front of me, and a U-Haul truck further down the road. As the woman walked up to the trucks, 2 masked men got out, both carrying rifles, and they talked amongst themselves as I waited inside. Knowing there was a very good chance I could die, I scrambled through my options, and I came to the conclusion that I only had one. I quickly reached over to the passenger side floor, grabbed the radio, and plugged it in. I begged anyone listening for help, trying my best to give my general location, telling anyone listening to call the police. Before I waited for a response, I unplugged it and threw it back on the floor, because the woman and the 2 men began walking over to my truck. Horrified that someone saw, I tried my best to remain calm as I could given the circumstances. One guy came around to the driver's side door and ordered me out of the truck at gunpoint, so I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out. He had me sit against the wheel, while at least 3 other men came out of the trucks in front and made their way to the back of the trailer. I listened for at least a half an hour as they unloaded the trailer. I was at the mercy of at least 6 people, who all had guns, who were robbing my entire trailer in a planned-out scheme. Eventually, I was ordered to the back, where they made me climb into the trailer, locking the doors behind me. I listened as they drove away shortly after, and although I was relieved, I realized that nobody knew where I was, and I was in the middle of the woods. I started to think about my family, who would soon find out that I was missing, and there was no way I could contact anyone for help. This ended up being the longest night of my life. I was stuck inside the trailer in complete darkness for the next 7 hours. The next morning, I heard someone pull up outside, so I pounded on the side and screamed for help. A guy told me he was calling the police and assured me I'd be okay. Shortly after, the doors finally swung open, and I was greeted by a swarm of police, along with the man who reported it. When I used the radio for help the night before, several truck drivers in the area heard it and reported it to the police, but since they had no idea where I was, they couldn't do anything about it. The man who saved me, who went by RJ, was a maintenance worker for the park who spotted my semi. I can't even describe the amount of relief I felt, because I was convinced I was going to die in that trailer. As soon as I gave the police my information, I borrowed one of the officers' phones and called my wife. She was hysterical, because she was notified in the middle of the night by my boss when I missed my routine check-ins. I assured her that I was okay, and promised to come straight home when I was done with the police. Unfortunately, the group of people that planned this were never caught, and I don't think they'll ever be. I've always heard stories of truckers getting robbed, but I never thought that I'd be one of them. This experience really taught me to look at life in a different way, and I realized that it could be taken away at any second, no matter who you are. Last summer, my boyfriend and I were driving back home after visiting his parents in Southern California, along with our 3-year-old yellow lab named Gunner. We have a place in Arizona, so the drive was about 12.5 hours. We took turns driving every 3 hours, where we'd pull into a rest stop, use the restroom, then switch and get back on the road. Everything was going smoothly, until my boyfriend pulled into a rest stop around 3 in the morning. I had passed out a couple hours prior, so he shook me awake to let me know that he needed a break. I inclined the passenger seat to sit up, and I looked around for a second to get my bearings. The parking lot was empty, except for a navy blue semi-truck parked in the back up against the woods. Whenever we stop at rest stops, we always take turns using the restroom so that somebody is always watching the car at all times. My boyfriend decided to go first, so I waited inside the car as I tried to wake myself up. I was still half asleep, so I decided to open up the door and stand up to stretch my legs, just to get myself moving again. As I was leaned up against the car, I noticed that the lights inside the cab of the semi-truck flipped on, and I watched a middle-aged man with a beard get out. It didn't strike me as anything concerning, since there were always truckers sleeping in rest stops at night. I looked back down and scrolled through my phone as he began approaching the rest stop. We parked directly in front of the building, so he had to basically walk right by me to get inside. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that he seemed to be looking at me, but I tried to act like I didn't notice. Just before he was about to open the door and walk inside, he turned around and spoke to me. "Excuse me, are you familiar with different perfume brands?" It was quite an odd question that I certainly wasn't expecting to hear, so I replied, "No, not really. Why do you ask?" He went on to explain that his daughter's birthday was coming up, and he was debating between 2 perfumes to buy that he saw in a magazine. They were both brands I'd never heard of before, so I told him I didn't know, and apologized that I couldn't help him out. He said that it was no problem, then disappeared into the building right after. I decided to get back inside the car, just to avoid any other possible interaction when he came back out. Not long after I sat back down, my boyfriend came back out and grabbed the leash to take Gunner out along the grass by the woods. While he headed back towards the woods, I got out and made my way into the building. The rest stop wasn't a nice one by any means. It seemed like it was poorly maintained, having an empty vending machine and an ancient-looking water fountain in the lobby. I opened the restroom door and just about puked when I took in the stench. Everything was coated in a layer of filth, almost giving off a yellowish tint between that and the light. I hurried up and washed my hands, then splashed cold water on my face to wake up, since I was next to drive. While I was bent over on the sink, I heard the door open. I snapped my head to the side, and standing there in the doorway was the truck driver who spoke to me earlier. I screamed and told him to get out, but instead of leaving, he took another step inside as the door closed behind him. Before I could even let out another scream, he revealed a knife, then put his finger to his lip to signal me to be quiet. Once I quieted down, he opened the door back up and waved his hand for me to walk out. I had no choice but to follow his order, so I sheepishly walked past him as I scanned the parking lot for my boyfriend. When I didn't see him in the car, I got even more worried, realizing he may have already gotten to my boyfriend. The man led me outside to his truck, and as soon as I stepped out, I screamed his name at the top of my lungs. The man lunged at me, but I began running straight towards the car. Just then, my boyfriend appeared out of the tree line with Gunner, running straight towards the trucker. As soon as he saw that, he stopped going for me and retreated back to his truck, where he got inside and drove off immediately. The entire semi was unmarked, having no company name or identifiable brand. Fortunately, my boyfriend was able to get the license plate of the semi, so we called the police right away. Once they arrived and we finished talking with them, we had no choice but to get back on the road and continue our drive home. I was a mess, so my boyfriend drove us the rest of the way back. We found out shortly after the incident that the semi-truck matching the license plate we gave the police was found abandoned on the side of the road, just a half hour away from the US-Mexico border. I have no doubt in my mind that he was involved with human trafficking, and I was literally seconds away from being kidnapped. I now realize that his initial attempt to talk to me was to most likely lure me to his truck, where he would have thrown me inside and taken off. These people are monsters, and they will disguise themselves however they feel necessary to trick innocent people into trusting them. No matter how nice or polite they may seem when you meet them, they only have one plan in mind, and in this case, that was to take me. I now avoid rest stops whenever I'm traveling, and I don't ever plan on returning to one.